before the end of the week. So, to understand the New Testament, it's essential to have at least a working knowledge of the land, the language, and the legacy of the nation of Israel. When God chose to become flesh in order to redeem the human race, he had to be born into a very specific place, a very specific race. He had to live life in a very specific place, but he also had to come at a very specific moment in history. So Jesus, as the Messiah, he's born into a specific race, into a very specific place, at a very specific time. In fact, John chapter 1, verse 1 talks about the Word becoming flesh and dwelling among us. When the Apostle Paul addresses the Greek philosophers at Athens in Acts chapter 17, verses 22 through 31, he described history as a prelude leading up to the coming of Christ, before whom we must all someday stand. And the early church fathers called this idea the preparatio evangelium, which is Latin for preparation for the gospel. And this is the idea that everything had to come to a certain time, a certain place, everything had to be in order in a certain way before the gospel could come. And this will make more sense a little bit later when we talk about the influence of Greek culture on the world, because the whole world at a certain point basically, for the most part, spoke Greek. And this unified language allowed the gospel, the New Testament message, to spread. So did the idea of Roman infrastructure such as roads, how the Romans became very good engineers, and they started building modern day roads almost, which still exist in Italy today. And those roads helped people travel from one place to the other faster, with greater ease, and they were able to spread the gospel using this one language across these new, what we would call almost like an interstate system, to share the message of Christ. Alongside this is a related idea of the scandal of particularity, which is the idea that Jesus was available for everybody. He's available for all. The message of the gospel is available for all, but it had to come to fruition during one time, one place, through one specific people. So it was very particular that the message, the salvation that God would bring the whole world, came through one man, which he came from one family, one race, the Jews, in a certain place, Israel, during the first century. Now, this is all important for us as we study the New Testament because it fits into a very specific history. And one of the names that historically is used to identify the Holy Land, otherwise known as Israel, in the Middle East, is Palestine. Palestine, the land of Palestine. So, if you look here at this graphic on the PowerPoint, if you look here, you see, the home country of Jesus is actually quite small by most modern standards. The nation of Israel is only about 1/3 the size of the state of Illinois. So if you look at this example here on my screen, we can see Israel compared to the United States, and you see United States there in yellow, and you can see Israel here in blue. That's Israel. Looks like it's right smack dab in the middle of Nebraska and Kansas. Over here you have Israel compared to New Jersey. You can see here that New Jersey is 7,787 square miles, whereas the nation of Israel is only 10,762 square miles. It's not that much bigger than the state of New Jersey itself. And when you look at that, that's 45 miles wide and 145 miles long. Israel is only 45 miles wide and 145 miles long. It's a very small country. And from the lofty peak of Mount Carmel, one can see the coastline of the Mediterranean Sea to the west and the border of modern-day Jordan to the east. The land of Palestine in Jesus' day consisted of three, what we maybe consider primary districts, three regions or areas. The first one is Galilee. Now, Galilee was in the north. I'll show you a map here in a second. And then you had Judea in the south, and then Samaria was in between. So there are three primary districts that split the land of Palestine up. So here's an example. Here's this map. Up here in the north, you see in this kind of a pink color, this is Galilee. This is the region of Galilee. And then, I'm sorry, here in the middle is Samaria. So here's Galilee, here's Samaria, and then here in the south is Judea. Jesus was born in Bethlehem, which is right here. It's in southern Judea. But he was raised in Nazareth, which is up here in Galilee. Most of Jesus' ministry actually occurred in Galilee, near his hometown of Capernaum. I think hometown. This is kind of his home base where he did his ministry. He grew up in Nazareth, though. That's why we call him Jesus Christ of Nazareth, or Jesus of Nazareth. And you can kind of see that this is all kind of taking place near the Sea of Galilee. This is this area right here, the Sea of Galilee. It should be noted that this famous body of water was not actually a sea or an ocean at all. It's actually rather about the size of a large man-made lake in some of American states. So, for example, here in Oklahoma, we have some rather large lakes, and it's about the size of some of our lakes. So then there's also the Jordan River. Just continuing to look at this map, you can see flowing, kind of branches out of the Sea of Galilee, but you can see here there's this river, and this river flows all the way down this eastern border between Galilee, Samaria, and Judea. This is the Jordan River. So you see it here, Jordan River. This is this little squiggly blue line here in the map, and it goes all the way down the side of Galilee, Samaria, and Judea, and it empties into the Dead Sea. Now, again, the Jordan River is the eastern boundary of Samaria and Judea. This is kind of interesting because the Dead Sea is the lowest natural place on Earth. Again, looking at this map, you see here the Dead Sea. The Jordan River feeds into the Dead Sea, but it's got no outlet. There's nothing, nothing leaves out of the Dead Sea. The Jordan River is the only major water source that flows into the Dead Sea. And because there's no outlet, the Dead Sea is landlocked, and then it's in the lowest valley on Earth. In this next map, you'll see here's the Mediterranean Sea over here, the coastal plains and foothills of the side of Israel. Here's the hill country of Judea. Jerusalem sits at a high point, 2,600 feet above sea level. Here's the Judean wilderness that we read about. And then here's the Dead Sea, the Jordan Valley, and here's the Dead Sea. Here's the valley, here's the Dead Sea. Now, the Dead Sea is landlocked, and it's the lowest valley on Earth. It's the lowest lowest natural lake, lowest elevation in the world, and at 1,290 feet below sea level. Now, all the minerals of the surrounding countryside of the Judean wilderness and on the other side of the valley, when it rains or any kind of major weather, these get washed down the sides of the valley, and all those minerals get locked into the Dead Sea. And with the sun baking basically all these minerals in the water, it basically concentrates all these minerals into salt. And there's so much salt in the Dead Sea that it's 10 times as salty as our ocean. So, if you've ever swam in the Pacific Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean, you know that it's salt water. It's very salty. But the Dead Sea is about 10 times as salty as the ocean. As such, nothing can live in the water of the Dead Sea. There's too much salt. No plants can survive in the Dead Sea, nor can any living creature such as a fish. Now, looking again back at this map, you can also see the Bible tells us in the New Testament that Jesus would make frequent trips from Galilee down to Jerusalem for the feast days, for the festival days, and we'll talk about those here in a couple weeks. And this is a major city in the southern Judea, and it's just Jerusalem is just a few miles from Bethlehem. And Jerusalem would be the place where Jesus died, is where he was buried, is where he arose from the dead, and it's where he ascended to heaven. Again, if you know the nativity story, Jesus was born in Bethlehem. he died in Jerusalem, but he grew up in Nazareth. And as an adult, he lived in Capernaum, doing, especially at the launch of his ministry. Now, here's another map of the land of Palestine from the east, looking from the east. So here again, this is looking from the east, looking to the west. We see in the south, here's southern Judea, here's Samaria in the middle, and here in the northern part of the area is Galilee. So you can see here Galilee is very mountainous, whereas Judea, as you get closer to the Mediterranean Sea, is lower to the sea level. So the history of So the history of Palestine could easily merit maybe a course of its own. The land of Israel frequently changed hands throughout their exciting existence as various armies, various nations, empires would lay hold onto the land, onto the area, and would basically oppress the Jewish people and rule over their country. And so there's several significant events that basically shape the children of Israel from, the nation of Israel is where the Messiah comes from. And among the two kind of events and periods of history that shape Israel, especially as it comes into the first century, the coming of the Messiah, are the exilic period and the post-exilic period. Now, in the exilic period, this is where in about 586 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon would expand the Babylonian Empire, and he comes and invades Israel. If you remember reading from the Old Testament, some of the stories you may have heard growing up in Sunday school, things like that, King Nebuchadnezzar and his armies invade Israel. They destroy Jerusalem. They actually burn down the temple to the ground. They slaughter multitudes of people, and then they take the surviving Jews to basically enslave them. They take them into exile back to Babylon. In 539 BC, the Persians would prevail. They go to war with the Babylonians, and the Persians defeat the Babylonians, and there is a king over Persia, and his name is Cyrus. And Cyrus allowed the captive Jews to begin to return home to their devastated Jerusalem. And in fact, if you go read some of the books of the Old Testament, some of the prophets, it details some of the stories of when they're in Babylon and when they make their trip home, when they're allowed to go home. And so the Old Testament prophets, Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi, they ministered to the nation of Israel during the post-exilic period. Also, the books of Nehemiah and Ezra detail many acts of restoration that were performed by the proportionally small band of returnees. So, for example, Nehemiah, in the book of Nehemiah, talks about when Cyrus lets the Persian king Cyrus lets the Jews return back home to Jerusalem, and he talks about how when they get there, they have to start rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem and rebuilding the walls of the temple. And so, among the things that the exiles brought back with them from Babylon back to Jerusalem when they are leaving exile, that's what the word post means. Post-exilic period is when they are returning home, or when they have returned home. One of the things that they take back with them from Babylon is the Aramaic language. Now, I apologize, I didn't put this on the screen, but maybe I can write it. Aramaic terrible handwriting, I know. If I had a pen tablet, this would work better. Aramaic, the Aramaic language, which the Jews were forced to learn when they were in exile in Babylon. So they had to learn Aramaic while they were exiled in Babylon. But when the Persian king Cyrus lets them return home, the Jews take the Aramaic language back with them. And so it becomes the predominant spoken language of the Jews throughout Israel. And again, this idea that Jesus, when he was born and when he grew up in the first century, Jesus most likely knew three languages. He knew Hebrew, ancient Hebrew. He knew Aramaic, because that's what the nation of Israel spoke at the time that Jesus is growing up. But they also spoke Greek. And the reason why they spoke Greek, as we talk about a little bit in class today, but as we'll find out here in the next few minutes, is because of Alexander the Great. And so Alexander the Great, maybe you guys have heard about him. Very interesting guy. Probably one of the more influential eras upon New Testament times occurred from 332 BC to about 63 BC, and this is known as the Hellenistic period. So here you can see I've kind of given a label here. This right here, this period right here is the Hellenistic era, the Hellenistic period, and it covered several different rulers, several different eras actually, but we call it Hellenistic because Hellenism, again, I'll spell this out, and it's terrible, I apologize, but Hellenism, Hellenism, my dot didn't go in there, there we go, Hellenism is the word that refers to the influence of Greek culture upon the rest of the world. So again, Hellenism is the influence of the Greek culture upon the rest of the world, especially the conquered countries and regions that the Greeks would conquer. And so basically what happens is Alexander the Great is a great military leader. He has several military campaigns, and he basically is trying to unite the world under one government, one ruler himself. And so he defeats the Persians in 333 BC. Okay, in 333 BC, Alexander the Great defeats the Persian Empire. And this allows the Greek to basically have complete world domination for a while, the known world at the time. And basically for centuries, extending into the days of Christ and the apostles in the first century, Greek culture penetrates every aspect of society. It becomes the center of literature, Greek commerce, medicine, religion, philosophy, everything in the regions of the Mediterranean, the Mesopotamian, and the Egyptian cultures is going to be influenced by Greek culture. So I mentioned this a little bit in class where definitely by the time of the first century when Jesus and the apostles are on the scene. In fact, if you remember the disciples, Peter and his brother Andrew, James and John, these guys are all fishermen. And as fishermen, they worked as a fisher's trade, but they also worked in economy, any economic venture, business, basically, that they wanted to do. If they wanted to buy and sell, they had to know how to speak Greek because, again, Alexander the Great, he comes and he conquers every land and region that he finds, and when he conquers these lands, he forces them to learn Greek, and he is instilling Greek culture in these conquered lands. And it's very kind of similar to how different other, throughout history, different countries have conquered regions and forced them to learn their culture. Think of the Germans during World War II. They come in, they conquer Poland, they start to conquer France, and they're trying to implement as a occupying force. They're trying to implement German culture into the places that they've conquered. The Greeks were the same way in ancient Greece, and here we see at getting ready to be the turn of the century into the first century, and the Greek language becomes the predominant language throughout the known world. And it stays the dominant language even until after the Romans begin their world domination and start to establish the Roman Empire. Even under Rome, the language still continues to be Greek. It's the common language of all people, even the rulers and those who are being ruled. And so after Alexander the Great's death, now Alexander the Great, he passes away in 323 BC. After his death, his empire was divided amongst his generals, who proved incapable of carrying on the global dominance that was achieved by Alexander. And, more distinctive eras would follow with some of his military generals. Now, his military generals, um, I tried to type these up for you. His military generals, these generals were, it's known, there's a word for this, it's the diadohi, the diadohi. Dia, again, that's supposed to be an I, terrible dot, diadohi. Again, I apologize for terrible writing on my computer, but diadohi. Now, for diadohi, these were the military generals under Alexander the Great. And basically, when Alexander dies, each general splits up the world that he had conquered up to that point. And there's basically these three major generals. You have Ptolemy, who was conquering and kind of ruling over Egypt and North Africa. Then you had Seleucus Nicator, who was over Mesopotamia all the way to India. And then finally you had Antigonus Cyclops, who ruled over Asia Minor, which included Syria and Palestine. All right, so each one of these generals ultimately wind up coming into control of a couple of different areas that Alexander had already gained and he was controlling. And so eventually Antigonus Cyclops was overthrown by Seleucus, and this brings it down to two primary eras of rule during this time of ancient Palestine. And that would be the Ptolemaic rule, which was from 320 BC to 198 BC, and the Seleucid rule, which lasted from 198 BC to 167 BC. And again, you can kind of see this in this outline right here. So the Greek under Alexander the Great, and then when he passes away, after he passes away, his countries are kind of, his regions are split up under his three generals, and then Antigonus Cyclops is overthrown by Seleucus. Ptolemaic rule lasts from 320 to 198, and the Seleucid rule from 198 to 167. Now, among the more significant events during these time frames for the Jews in Israel was the translation of the Old Testament into Greek. Now, we talked about this last week. Now, this is the Septuagint, and again, you can kind of see this right here, the Septuagint. This is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. Remember, I told you guys, there's an abbreviation for the Septuagint, and the abbreviation is the LXX. This is the Roman numerals for 70. And here, the reason why this happens, the reason why the LXX is even, the Septuagint is even brought into existence, is because of the Greek influence on Hebrew life and culture. And the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, is going to be translated from Hebrew into Greek, because again, Greek was the language that was spoken by the conquered world at that time. And the Septuagint becomes the standard scripture, the standard Bible for Greek-speaking Jews, which includes the Apostle Paul in the first century, in the early church for the first couple of centuries. And so Greek culture definitely continues to have an influence even after Alexander the Great is no longer in control. So, just bear with me, sorry. All right. Well, moving on. So the Septuagint, as we will see, it's the Greek. It's the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, and it continues to spread the Judeo religion, the Judeo values of the Old Testament, even in this new Greek world, that Alexander basically establishes. But even a little bit later, if we go back to my other screen, the Seleucid rule, the Greek Empire doesn't always last. Um, Basically, what happens is a war breaks out, and later on, this is the Maccabean War, which was about 167 BC to 141 BC. And then the Hasmonean dynasty. The Maccabean War featured the desecration of the Jewish temple by Assyrian. Assyrian is the same thing as the Seleucid Empire, the Seleucid rule. So there's a Seleucid general, there's a Syrian general. His name is Antiochus Epiphanes. And in 167 BC, he basically comes in. Remember, they've already got control of Palestine. And in 167 BC, he comes in and desecrates the Jewish temple. Basically, he comes in and sets up a statue of himself and tries to institute worship to himself as God. And this is known as the Great Desolation, the desolation of the temple. And this takes place in 67 BC. And as you can tell, this does not sit well with the Jewish people. And so there's a subsequent revolt by a small Jewish army, which is led by a man named Mattathias. And Mattathias and his son Judas Maccabeus. Now, their brave efforts resulted in a surprising military victory that allowed them to reclaim the temple. So the Maccabean War took place in 167 BC, and it lasted to about 141 BC. And the following year, in 140 BC, the family of the Maccabeans, basically the descendants of the Maccabees, established the Hasmonean dynasty. So basically, they established the Hasmonean kingdom. Now, these are Jews. They've taken control back of Israel from the Greeks, and particularly the Seleucid Syrians. And when they reclaimed the temple and set up the Hasmonean dynasty, the Jewish kingdom again, this is what the holiday Hanukkah is made. This is what the Hanukkah um, season is celebrating. It's celebrating when the Jews won victory, the Maccabean revolt, won victory over the Seleucid general Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, this family, the Hasmonean dynasty, if we go back a couple of slides here, the Hasmonean dynasty, in 63 BC, again, there's another kind of push to, I'm sorry, the Hasmonean dynasty, before I move on, the Hasmonean dynasty, as we can trace down here, you see Mattathias. He had a couple of sons, and one is Simon, one is Judas Maccabeus. And from Simon becomes basically a leader, and his son, John, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, John Hyrcanus, becomes basically the king. Again, they set up this kingdom, the Hasmonean kingdom. John Hyrcanus becomes this ruler of Palestine in 135 BC. And he has a couple of sons, one of which is Alexander Jannaeus. Now, Alexander and Aristobulus I, they both have this connection, this child coming into Salome Alexandra, and she's meant to be king for a little bit. But ultimately, Jannaeus' son, Hyrcanus II, is born, and his son Aristobulus II. Now, Aristobulus gives birth to Antigonus II, and specifically, the leadership flows through Alexander. Alexander gives birth to Aristobulus III, who marries Mariamne, and Aristobulus III and Mariamne give birth to Herod the Great. So there's this Hasmonean dynasty, this lineage from Mattathias, who is a Jew, who kicks out the Greeks, specifically the Seleucids, which were the ancient Syrians, and kicks them out. And there is a period of about 77 years of Jewish rule from 140 BC to 63 BC. And so what we see happen here is here you can see the Palestine under the Maccabees, the Hasmonean dynasty. You can see how different colors shaded for each one of the different descendants of the Maccabees who ruled basically Palestine in just before the 1st century. Now, in 63 BC, something else happens. In 63 BC, you have the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire has already started taking control of the world. Okay, the Roman Empire obviously is based out of Rome, Italy, and they had basically spread across the known world and started taking over everything that the Greeks had taken over. So they spread and they take over Macedonia, Asia Minor, down through Syria, into Palestine and Egypt and parts of South Africa. And so the Romans were this is the one that everybody hears about in history, and we read stories like Julius Caesar, and the Romans were the empire that just conquered the world. This is the great Roman Empire. And here, around 63 BC, this push of the Roman period led to a Roman general named Pompey, and Pompey entered Judea in 63 BC, and with his armies, he added Israel to the list of regions that was being swallowed up by the powerful Roman war machine. And so when they come in and they take over Palestine, 12,000 Jewish citizens were killed the day that Pompey captures the city of Jerusalem. And Roman rule was established throughout the land with legions of soldiers maintaining a visual presence throughout Israel. So basically they are occupying every land that they conquer, just like the Germans occupied different regions in Europe during World War II. The Romans would occupy lands that they conquered and that they defeated in war. They would leave Roman soldiers behind, and they would establish Roman governors, and that area would become a new Roman province. And so the Roman Empire just spreads. It spreads from across Italy, again, all through Macedonia and Asia Minor, up through Egypt and the northern parts of North Africa. And around this time, heavy taxation is going to be introduced upon the conquered people to support the Roman Empire. And these were the conditions in the place at the time that Jesus is born. Rome is in control. Heavy taxation is being placed upon the people of Palestine to support the Roman government there in the province of Palestine. And some of the most noteworthy figures within the life of Christ were the Jewish leaders under Rome, which were known as the Herods. Now, going back to a couple of slides here, after Rome gets in control, they set up the Herodian dynasty, the Herods. Now, again, here's Herod the Great, all right? He's the end of the Hasmonean dynasty. Herod the Great, hopefully you recognize that name. And Herod the Great is the Herod that is in control when Jesus is born. And so during this time, Herod the Great, basically the most prominent and powerful Herod, Herod the Great rules from 37 BC to about 4 BC. And he's known for building the extravagant city of Caesarea on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. And Caesarea would be this port city in the Palestinian area that would allow the Roman government to basically float across the Mediterranean Sea anytime that they needed to. And Herod would not only build the port city of Caesarea, but he also authorized the rebuilding of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. Now, the Romans were not threatened by the religion of Judaism. They were not threatened by Jewish religion. They believed in the multiplicity of gods, or religious exercises of plural gods. And if allowing the Jews to continue the practice of Judaism, to continue worshiping God, would pacify the Jews, if that would bring peace, the Romans were okay with that. They didn't always force their conquered people to worship, to have a polytheistic religion like the Romans did. And so the Jews were allowed to continue to worship God. And so they helped rebuild the temple under Herod. Actually, Herod led this, and basically, this kept the Jews from revolting a lot of times. And so Jesus is born under the reign of Herod the Great. And he's the ruler who authorized all the male young children around Bethlehem to be killed. You can read this in your Bible in Matthew chapter 2, verse 16 and verse 18. Now, some of you be like, wait a second, I thought Jesus was born like year zero or whatever. Well, the dating system of the calendar that we operate on is a little bit off. Most likely this is going to be around 4 BC when Jesus is actually born. And so if you turn in your Bibles, your New Testament, to Matthew chapter 2, verse 16 through 18, it reads, I'm reading from the English Standard Version. It reads, "Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more." And here Jeremiah, it's basically quoting Jeremiah 31:15, where Jeremiah gives this prophecy that the children of Israel are going to, literally the babies, the infants of Israel are going to be murdered again, just like they were in Egypt under the Egyptian rule when Moses comes to the scene. Jeremiah gives a prophecy and says this is going to happen again. And King Herod, who hears about the baby Messiah from the wise men go and visit Jesus when he's approximately 2 years old, and because it takes them that long to find him, because they come from the east. And when they do find him, they go and they meet with King Herod, and he says, "Tell me about this king. I want you to bring me back. Tell me exactly where he is, so that I may worship him." But if you continue to read the Christmas nativity story in the Bible, especially in Matthew and in Luke, the first couple of chapters, you'll see that King Herod is lying, and then angel comes and tells the wise men, "Don't go back and tell Herod, because he's going to kill the baby Messiah." And so they don't tell him; they trick him. Then they basically tell him that they can't find him and whatnot. And so he gets mad, and because he knows he's lying, he knows they're lying, and he kills. He orders that all babies in the Palestine, the region of Palestine, especially in Bethlehem, are going to be killed. All newborns 2 years and younger. And so from here we we move that the Herod the Great dies, and his 3 sons divide up his kingdom in Israel. And again, I apologize, I don't have these written down, but I will go back and write these up for you. So after Herod so you have Herod the Great. Oop, I'm sorry. Let me, can I erase that? Let's see, screen, let's see, erase pen. There we go. Okay, so you have Herod the Great. Okay, after these 3 gentlemen, you have Herod the Great. I'm not going to spell out the, just for time's sake. You have Herod the Great. And then after Herod, you have his 3 sons, and they divide up the kingdom. There's Archelaus. Actually, you know what? I'll do it quicker this way. Archelaus. Let's do it this way. It'll be quicker. And I apologize that I didn't put this in the PowerPoint. But so after Herod the Great, okay, then you have his son Archelaus, and Archelaus would rule in the south, which would be like Judea. Then you have his son Antipas, who ruled in the north over Galilee. And then you had his son, his 3rd son, Philip, who ruled as tetrarch over the northern regions of the kingdom. All right, so so a tetrarch is a joint ruler. So he ruled over the northern regions, uh, again under the authority of the Roman Empire. So again, he's not Roman. These are actually Jews. Herod the Great was actually Jewish. Archelaus, Antipas, and Philip are going to be from Jewish descent, but they were Jews that favored the Romans, and so the Romans placed Herod into authority, and so Archelaus ruled in the south in Judea, Antipas ruled in the north over Galilee, and Philip ruled as tetrarch over the northern regions of the kingdom. Now, Archelaus was a vicious ruler. Mary and Joseph settled back in Galilee to avoid being under Archelaus' dangerous rule when they returned with Jesus from Egypt. Again, you can go back to Matthew chapter 2, and you can read this story about this particular Herod. In Matthew chapter 2, verse 22, pull this up here in my Bible. Again, I'm reading from the English Standard Version. But when Herod the Great had died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, and saying, Rise, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. Herod the Great had passed away. And but when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, Joseph was afraid to go there, and being warned in a dream, he withdrew to this district of Galilee. So he doesn't go. He doesn't go back. He doesn't stay in Judea from Egypt. When they come out of Egypt, they don't go back to Jerusalem or Bethlehem. They basically go back to Galilee, and they settle in Galilee. And so he settles in Galilee and lives in Nazareth. Now, again, if you were to remember that map that I showed you guys earlier, Galilee is the northern district, and so to fulfill the prophecies that were prophesied by the prophets, the Messiah would be born in Nazareth, and he would be called a Nazarene. And so here we see that Archelaus is mentioned very specifically in Matthew chapter 2, verse 22. And Joseph takes Mary and the newborn Jesus from Egypt. They hop over Jerusalem and the lower part of Judea, and they go all the way back up to Galilee to escape Archelaus' rule, because they would rather hang out under Antipas' rule. And so Herod, Jesus' ministry, he begins there in Galilee under the rule of Antipas, and he constructed, Herod Antipas would construct a city adjacent to the Sea of Galilee, and this was called the Tiberias. And so, again, it's not really showing on this map because that's the Maccabean map. Let's see if I can get to another. Here we go. Up here in the northern region, there's Caesarea Philippi. There's the port city of Tyre, and so there's the port city of Caesarea and Joppa. And so Philip creates the port city, the Caesarea Philippi, which you can see. I'm sorry, not the port city, but he creates this fort city, the Caesarea Philippi. And this is where Jesus would eventually announce his intentions to build a church after being identified as the Son of God and the Messiah for the first time in Matthew chapter 16, verse 13 and 16. Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 through 16. And I'll read it to you guys. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked the disciples, Who do people say that I am? Or who do people say that the Son of Man is? And they said, Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. And Jesus said to them, But who do you say that I am? Simon Peter replied, You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And so here Jesus, hangs out and grows up in Galilee. Now, Herod Antipas was the Herod Pilate had sent Jesus to see just before his crucifixion, while while Herod was in Jerusalem for the Passover. So again, going back to kind of the little notes that I was typing up for you. Here we go. So Herod Antipas is the Herod that's ruling. Remember, when Jesus is arrested and he's taken before Pontius Pilate, just before he's crucified, Herod is hanging out in Jerusalem. He is the Herodian king. Okay, he's ruling. He's ruling over the north in Galilee, but he goes and hangs out in Jerusalem for the Passover. And Herod Antipas, gets a little bit cocky, and he wanted Emperor Caligula to make him basically king over everything, but unfortunately he winds up getting banished. The Roman Emperor Caligula doesn't do this, and so this Herod's rule doesn't last very long. Now, there are also some governors that were appointed to rule by Rome during these days. And the New Testament mentions 3 of them by name. So again, I'm just going to kind of type out some notes for you, because I don't think these made these into the PowerPoint here. But so there are some governors appointed by Rome during the following days after Jesus' birth, as he's growing up in these years. And the New Testament actually mentions 3 by name. We have Pontius Pilate, you have Felix, and then you have Festus. Now, Jesus was sentenced to death by Pilate, okay? That's Pontius Pilate. He's the one that, Jesus, when he's crucified, Jesus goes before him and he basically judges him and basically tells the Jews, well, I don't find him guilty of anything. And they say, still crucify him, crucify him. And Paul, the Apostle Paul, would later stand before the other 2. Paul would stand before both Felix and Festus while being on trial because of his ministry. You can read about that in Acts chapter 24 through 25. And for a period of time, the Roman emperors, they would appoint kings, again, over Judea and over Galilee, like they did, the Herods. This includes Herod Agrippa I. Herod Agrippa I, who is the grandson of Herod the Great. Now, Herod Agrippa is mentioned in Acts chapter 12, 1 through 2. Then you have Herod Agrippa II, who is the great-grandson of Herod the Great. And this Herod is mentioned in Acts chapter 26. Okay? In Acts chapter 12, 21 through... let me back up. Herod Agrippa I was given rule over Galilee and Perea after Herod Antipas was banished. So remember, I told you that the Roman Emperor Caligula, he banishes Antipas because Antipas wants to be ruler over everything in Palestine, and the emperor banishes him. So Herod Agrippa I rules over Galilee and Perea. Okay, he also gains control over Judea and Samaria. Basically, what Antipas wanted, this Herod Agrippa I actually gets. Now, Herod Agrippa sympathized with the Jewish leaders, and so he executed James, the son of Zebedee, one of Jesus' apostles. And he is the Herod that puts Peter in prison in Acts chapter 12. So he is the Herod. This Herod places Peter in prison in Acts 12, 1 through 4. All right. Now, Acts 12, 21 through 23 tells us that Agrippa calls himself a god at a local Jewish festival, and God strikes him dead. Herod Agrippa I, okay, he's mentioned again in Acts 12, 21 through 23, and he calls himself God and is struck dead by the God for doing so. Now, the Apostle Paul would appear before Herod Agrippa II. In Acts 25:13 through 26:32, while he was imprisoned in Caesarea around 60 AD. I'll just put a note there, imprisoned in Caesarea in 60 AD. And now Paul tries to win Agrippa II to Christ, but Agrippa II rejects him. I'll just pull this up real quick and read the passage to you. Acts chapter 26, 28. Acts 26, 28. And Agrippa said to Paul, let me back up, and he says, Paul's addressing King Agrippa. He says, verse 26, he said, "For the king knows about these things, and to him I speak boldly, for I am persuaded that none of these things has escaped his notice, for this has not been done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you believe." And Agrippa said to Paul, "In a short time would you persuade me to be a Christian?" And Paul said, "Whether short or long, I would to God that not only you, but also all who hear me this day might become such as I am, except for these chains." Then the king rose, and the governor, and Bernice, and those who were sitting with them. And when they had withdrawn, they said to one another, "This man is doing nothing to deserve death or imprisonment." And Agrippa said to Festus, "If this man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar." So, as we'll read about when we talk about the book of Acts, Paul makes his way all the way to Caesar because he meets with Festus, he meets with Herod Agrippa II, and eventually goes to, that's how the book of Acts closes, he meets with the Roman emperor, or he's waiting to meet with the Roman emperor. And so these leaders that were established by the Roman government are all over the place in the New Testament, as we've discovered. And so I want to go back to our PowerPoint for a second. And there's just one date that really stands out in biblical history and prophecy above all the others. And this date is very important, the importance of 70 AD. Now, the greatly oppressed Jewish people had begun a revolt in 66 AD. Now, I don't have this in the PowerPoint. I apologize. I do not know why I do not. But again, I'll type them out for you guys as we continue in the lecture. Pretty sure. Yeah, we got some there. Okay. So in 70 AD, what basically happens, the Jewish people, they begin a revolt in 66 AD, and they fight against the Romans. And unfortunately, in 70 AD, the Roman general Titus, okay, I'll type this out. Okay, so here we have in 63 AD, the Jews revolt against the Romans. In 70 AD, the Roman general Titus comes and basically takes over Jerusalem. He comes and captures Jerusalem to put down this rebellion. And the Jewish inhabitants were killed or enslaved. And if you go back and you read the history that is set up, but again, this is Roman history. This is not biblical history necessarily, although there's hints of this happening in the Bible. But it's recorded that in history, General Titus, he comes in and he kills many, many Jews, or he starts enslaving others, and he burns the temple to the ground. Now, this is very important. This event is important because this is the last time that the temple, this is when the temple was destroyed, and since 70 AD the Jewish temple has not been rebuilt. Now there's prophecy saying that the temple will be rebuilt again towards the time right before Jesus returns, but this is the second era temple, that what's known as the temple of Herod the Great, because again Herod's the one that rebuilt the temple, and this temple is destroyed by this Roman emperor Titus. And Jesus basically, Jesus makes a prophecy, and he's standing outside um, of the temple, and he reminds them, and he tells them that there's a story in the New Testament where basically tells them that, listen, um, this temple is going to be destroyed. He actually foretells the destruction of the temple of Jerusalem. This is recorded both in Matthew and in Luke. And if you look at both of those stories in those Gospels, Jesus tells about the destruction of Jerusalem. For example, Mark chapter 13 is, for example, the chapter in Mark that contains um, the prediction that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed and that the temple itself will be destroyed as well. Um, Luke chapter 21, verse 5 through 6, basically said the same thing. Matthew 24, verse 3, talks about the fact that destroying the temple was basically going to be taking place. And so the temple is destroyed, and Israel is just, you know, insulted because it forces the Jews to end the sacrificial worship that was taking place in the temple, and it forces the Jews to scatter throughout the world for their own safety. They're not allowed to stay in Jerusalem. They're not allowed to stay in Palestine, and this is very important. This is very, very significant. The fall of Jerusalem brings about something very important that you need to write down for your notes. The break between Judaism and Christianity takes place with the fall of the temple in 70 A.D., the temple in Jerusalem. When Titus destroys the temple, and the Jews are basically the Jews are driven out. The Jewish Christians are expelled, and they leave, and they spread throughout the world, and they take the gospel message with them. And it's a significant moment for the church because it forced the Christian movement to expand beyond the city of Jerusalem, which is where their faith originally kind of emerges. And this break between Judaism and Christianity is now complete with the destruction of Jerusalem, and the Jewish Christians are forced to leave. They take the gospel out, and it goes throughout the Gentile country, the Gentile nations. And this required the church to develop a new theological vocabulary. They had to move away from Jewish mindset and introduce a Gentile understanding of God and Gentile understanding of Christ and ministry styles in order to reach the Gentiles. Remember, Gentiles is a word that basically means anybody who is not a Jew. And so out of this action, out of this arose the New Testament canon. Okay? Now, there are some ideas that are important to realize when it comes to Judaism in this period of time. When one reads of all of the enemies of Israel and the many centuries of persecution that they had to endure, a very legitimate question is, well, how were they able to stay together as a people? Well, stated another way, what were some of the unifying factors of Judaism that knit the inhabitants of the nation together throughout the years, despite persecution, despite being spread across the country and the world eventually? Well, number one is that God and Israel, God has this, he identifies Israel as their, he identifies Israel as their people. They are the people of God. And no understanding of the life and times of Jesus Christ is complete without the grasp of the significance of the Jerusalem temple. For example, in the life of every Israel, not only are the Israelites described as God's chosen people, but God has a very special chosen place, and that's the Holy Land. This is where the Messiah is to be born. This is where the Messiah is crucified. And every Israelite knew the importance of Jerusalem and the temple that was located in Jerusalem, and the Israelites worshiped God there. This was where Yahweh would lead Moses and the people to when they left Egypt. He led them to what is now Israel. It's a very special place. And their land and the people of Israel were a promise that were given to Abraham in Genesis chapter 10 and in Genesis chapter 12. And there, God promises Abraham. He says, "Listen, if you will continue your relationship with me, I will, from your seed, from your descendants, I will bless every nation in the world, and your descendants will number greater than the sands outside the ocean." And this is a promise that not only they're going to receive land, but that they are the chosen people, and the descendants of Abraham are going to form into a nation. And these promises are very near and dear to the Israelites, to the Jews. And so for them to be enslaved or to be exiled away from home is very disastrous, especially even when they come back home and things are occupied by the Romans. It's still just very discouraging. And then you see the synagogue. Now, the synagogue was a meeting place for Jews who could not meet in the temple. And very specifically, the synagogues rose in popularity after the destruction of the temple. But if you lived outside of Jerusalem or you couldn't make it to Jerusalem, the synagogue was just a meeting place that the Jews could gather to meet and to worship God and to study the Old Testament, to study the Tanakh. But after 70 AD, synagogues grew exponentially because the temple was no longer in existence. So people who normally make a pilgrimage to the temple to worship would now do so in synagogues. Now the diaspora, D-I-A-S-P-O-R-A, diaspora, D-I-A-S-P-O-R, is it's a Greek term for the Jews that were scattered across the world. Jews that were scattered across the world. The diaspora, the Jewish diaspora, they met in synagogues all over the world. And it's this thought that the synagogue was first used during the Babylonian captivity, because again, the temple's been destroyed, they're in Babylon, they're in captivity there, and so the idea here, the researchers and scholars suggest that the synagogues probably first emerged when they were in Babylon under captivity. But when they come back to Israel, especially after the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD, synagogues continue to grow and be a part of the story. We read synagogue we in the New Testament. For example, Jesus stands up and reads from the scroll of Isaiah describing when the Messiah would come, and he stands up and he says, "In this very day, basically this prophecy has been fulfilled in front of you, because here I am." He is standing in a synagogue, and so alongside the temple and the synagogue came the Torah and various different traditions. Now remember, Torah is Hebrew for law or teaching. So the law, the Torah, and various different traditions that were based upon the Torah, and the teaching of the elders that were very important. This is another unifying factor. So the Jewish people are unified because they are the chosen people of God. They are unified in their land. It's very special. This is why it was so important that Israel became a nation in the late 1940s after World War II, because they had not been a nation for so many centuries, and they officially became a nation that was recognized by the rest of the world. So they are unified because they're the chosen people of God. They're unified because they have a special place, the Holy Land. They're unified in synagogues across the world, especially after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. They're also unified through the Torah and the tradition, which is taught through teachers and rabbis at the synagogues. And the different traditions would emerge from the Torah, and these teachings that the elders in the synagogue would teach would be very important to Judaism. And finally, the temple, the priesthood, and the festivals gave the Jews a sense of identity. The temple was massive. If you go back and you read the Old Testament, you see descriptions of the temple, and Herod just made it that much better. It was just a big, huge temple. And when Jesus said he would destroy the temple in 3 days, in John chapter 2, verse 19, the Jewish leaders were enraged. They were just mad and angry. But Jesus was speaking prophetically about his own body, how he is the temple, and that he was going to die and that he would raise 3 days later, which would lead to God's people no longer needing the temple, which, again, was itself destroyed in 70 AD after the Jewish revolt against the Romans. And so Pontius Pilate orchestrated a massive refurbishing of the temple, a project that took over about a half a century, a little bit over 50 years, extensive and very expensive work. And every Jewish citizen made annual pilgrimages to the temple at Jerusalem to observe holy feasts, such as Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Pentecost, which is what we read about in Acts chapter 2. In contrast to the one temple in Israel, there were hundreds of synagogues throughout the nation. Almost every village had these places that were designated for religious discussion, teaching, and prayer. Jesus ministered extensively in synagogues according to the Gospels. Now, at the time that Jesus came, there were several political and religious groups that held prominent place in the life of the Jewish people and the Jewish nation itself. Among the primary religious groups in the first century were the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Zealots. Now, I believe this is starting in page 38 of your textbook there in chapter 2. But let's just kind of talk about some of these groups real quick. Now, the Pharisees were the most influential and best known of these religious political groups of the Jews during the first century. Now, although they were small in number, the Pharisees had risen to wield so much power in the nation that they were considered interpreters of the law. The Pharisees were the interpreters of the Torah. And their name actually means separate ones, and they considered themselves that their own oral tradition, the oral teaching that they gave, traditions that were based off of supposedly years and years and years of teachings passed down, specifically since the Babylonian captivity, that their oral teachings, the oral tradition of the Pharisees, was considered as equally authoritative as the Old Testament Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh itself. Now, they added so much to the written record and viewed themselves as spiritually superior to everyone else that they were kind of stuck up. And Jesus, he butted heads with the Pharisees the most, as we read in the Gospel. In fact, he saved one of his most sternest rebuke for the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 23. You see another example of that in Mark chapter 7, verse 8. Their tradition, they taught that their tradition was just as binding and authoritative as the Hebrew scriptures themselves, as God's commandments. So very, very, very strict group. Then you have the Sadducees. Now, the Sadducees was another group that frequently challenged Jesus, and they constituted a very wealthy priestly aristocracy. Theologically, they were aristocrats. Okay, they're kind of a priestly group. They come from the priestly family of Levites, if you will. And, theologically, they rejected almost everything that the Pharisees believed. So the Sadducees did not believe in angels. They did not believe in spirits. They did not believe in the final judgment. They did not believe in the coming of a Messiah, which obviously would make sense because if the Messiah came, there wouldn't be much use for the priests now, would there? During his Passion Week, the Sadducees thought to discredit Jesus by attacking his assertion in the resurrection, because remember, they don't believe in the idea of a resurrection, but Jesus is teaching about the resurrection in Matthew chapter 22, verses 23 through 32. Matthew chapter 22, verses 23 through 32. I'm going to pull that up and read it to you real quick. Matthew 23 verses, Matthew chapter 22 verses 23 through 32. The same day Sadducees came to him, Jesus, who say that there is no resurrection, and they asked him a question, saying, Teacher, Moses said, if a man dies having no children, his brother must marry the widow and raise up his offspring, the offspring of his brother. Now there were 7 brothers among us. The first married and died, and having no offspring left his wife to his brother. So too the second, and the third, down to the 7th man. After them all, the woman died. In the resurrection, therefore, of the 7, whose wife will she be? For they all had her. But Jesus answered them, You are wrong, because you know neither the Scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry, nor are they given in marriage, but they are like angels in heaven. And as for the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was said to you by God? I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not God of the dead, but he is God of the living. Now, the Sadducees thought they were being a little bit witty here, but Jesus replies back to them and he says, listen, you guys don't even really believe in the resurrection, but you're ignorant of what the Hebrew scriptures teach us, the Old Testament teaches us about this, because how can God be the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which is all throughout the Old Testament, that phrase is, and Jesus saying, listen, why would we call him the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob if they're dead and they don't ever expect to be living again? And so he really butted heads with these guys as well. And although the Pharisees and the Sadducees were very bitter adversaries, they don't normally get along, they actually united together in their efforts to destroy Jesus. Then there's this other group. It's not in the PowerPoint on the screen, but you can write this down. It's the Sanhedrin. I'll go ahead and write it on as a pen, because the Sanhedrin, the Sanhedrin. Now, that's supposed to be an Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin. Now, the Sanhedrin was the Jewish Supreme Court, and it was made up of 70 members from both the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Sanhedrin is mentioned a few times in the New Testament. And the Sanhedrin, this Jewish court, this Supreme Court, this Jewish Supreme Court, if you will, it's headed up by the high priest, which the high priest would have been a Sadducee. And we read about this group when Jesus is arrested after he's taken out of the Garden of Gethsemane, and he's arrested and he's taken before the high priest and the group, and all these witnesses all of a sudden start coming together, and they have the trial to condemn him, and they say, he deserves to die. That's the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin is the Supreme Court, the council that basically says, okay, Jesus, you deserve to die. But they're not allowed to kill. They're not allowed to kill anybody as a result of crime, so they have to have the Roman government do it, which is why Jesus goes before Pontius Pilate. Now, you also have the Essenes. The Essenes, they're a third prominent group in the first century in Israel. Now, this is a very reclusive group, and they're not really mentioned. They're not really mentioned in the New Testament, but they are attested to by the writings of Josephus, Philo, and Pliny. Now, we talked about these guys in class today. In class, we talked about how Josephus was a Jewish historian that worked for the Roman government. Philo is another Jewish historian, and Pliny is actually a Roman governor / historian who writes letters. And they are the Essenes are mentioned by each one of these guys. And when it was apparent that they had no military chance against the rugged Roman forces, the Essenes, when Rome, remember, invaded Palestine, the Essenes retreated to a community known as Qumran. And this is located near the Dead Sea, and they dwelt in caves next to the Dead Sea, and they were there to await the Messiah. And it's likely that the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were discovered in 1947, they were placed in these caves. The Dead Sea Scrolls, if you don't know the story, the Dead Sea Scrolls were found by an Egyptian shepherd in 1947. They were most likely placed in these caves in Qumran by the Essenes. The Essenes basically kept copies of the Old Testament. That's what the Dead Sea Scrolls are, the copies of the Old Testament, copies of other literature, and in fact, some of the oldest, most complete copies of the Bible, especially Isaiah and Ezekiel, were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls there at the Essene community in Qumran. And the Essenes are these guys that devoted their entire lives to copying and preserving the ancient manuscripts of the Old Testament scripture, the Hebrew Tanakh. Now, another group are the Zealots. This group, the Zealots, this is a fourth voice that was often heard within the first century political Israel. And these guys are mentioned a couple of times in the New Testament. These men are very radical. There's a radical faction that was they're very devout Jews who believed that the promised Messiah would not um, he would come only through a military conquest against the Romans. So the Zealots are those that believed that when the Messiah would come, that he would come and deliver, he basically kick out the Romans and reestablish a Jewish nation again, another kingdom. And they were always ready to fight somebody for the ideas of their homeland. And again, if you've ever seen any movies about Jesus, about the crucifixion, there's always zealots mentioned because the zealots were those guys out there ready to fight. They were ready to go to war and kick out the Romans. And in fact, the Zealots were at the forefront of the revolt effort that began in 66 AD that led to the eventual destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. One of Jesus' 12 disciples, okay, in Luke chapter 6, verse 15, one of the 12 disciples is a zealot. Luke chapter 6, verse 15. He in Luke chapter 6 starting in verse 12, Luke is listing some of the disciples, the 12 apostles, and I'll just read them out to you. And verse 13, and when the day came, Jesus called his disciples, and he chose from them 12, and he named them apostles, Simon, whom he named Peter, and Andrew his brother, James and John, Philip and Bartholomew, and Matthew and Thomas, and James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon, who was called the Zealot, and Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who later became a traitor. So Simon the Zealot Simon is part of this group, and he's one of the 12 one of the 12 disciples. There's also some scribes. Scribes, as the name suggests, they were former, these scribes were interpreters of the law who were very skilled at reading and writing. I haven't listed that in the PowerPoint there, but that's another group, the scribes, Scribes. They were people who copied the Old Testament. They read and wrote declarations and messages and all kinds of things. Again, especially copying Scripture, copying the Old Testament. You also have the Herodians, and the Herodians were the political followers of King Herod, any of the King Herods. And so the Herodians were Jews that allied themselves with Herod, which meant that they were aligning themselves with the Romans. Because again, Herod the Great, and all of his descendants were Jews who was being the Herods were Jews that were used by Romans to control the Jewish country. And so the Herodians are Jews that support the King Herods, that the Romans put in place. Then you have this other group, the Am Haaretz. The Am Haaretz, it means people of the land, or the common people. Now, they did not affiliate with any specific group, probably closest to the views of the Pharisees, but they were despised by the Pharisees as people who did not know anything. Now, later rabbinic literature describes the Am Haaretz as people who did not tithe. They did not read the Shema. The Shema is the morning and evening devotion of the Jews, of Jewish literature. They do not wear the tefillin. The tefillin was a small leather box that contained the scripture. You go back and you read some of this, you might see this described in the New Testament, but definitely in Jewish literature, you'll see this all over the place. They would take copies of the Ten Commandments of Jewish literature, and they would strap it to their foreheads, or they'd wear it around their bodies, typically on the forehead. And so they didn't wear those. They also didn't teach their children the Torah. They didn't teach their children the law. Most Jews memorized most of the Torah, if not all of it, by the time they were 13. And so, the Am Haaretz were the people that were lost sheep of the house of Israel. And these are the people that Jesus ministered to most directly. These are the people that, when we read Jesus interacting with people, these are the Am Haaretz. And he had the most compassion on him. In fact, in Mark chapter 6, verse 34, he calls them the sheep without a shepherd, on whom he had compassion. And so the 12 apostles and the disciples that we read about in the New Testament and the Gospel, these were all part of the Am Haaretz. The 12 apostles came from this group. Finally, the Samaritans. Now, the Samaritans is another group which merits very special kind of identification in a few moments. The Samaritans were half Jews who, over an extended period of time, they intermarried with the Gentiles. I kind of explained that a little bit today when we looked at the map in class. They were mixed Jews. They had intermarried throughout history with Gentiles, and they kind of settled in that center region. Remember, Palestine split up into three regions. You have Galilee in the north, you have Samaria in the center, and then you have Judea in the south. And so the Samaritans, there in the middle, they were held in contempt by the devout Jews, who viewed them as second-class citizens and inferior, just because of the fact that they were a mixed race. And this fact enhances the effect that Jesus makes when he tells the story about the Good Samaritan, for example, because in the Good Samaritan story, Jesus is describing this Good Samaritan. There's a Jew who comes and he's hurt, he's robbed and beaten up he's mugged by some bandits, and he's left on the side of the road to die. And a Jewish priest walks by and doesn't see him, doesn't take care of him. Several prominent figures of Jewish society pass by. People who are supposed to stop and help him, scribes, teachers of the law, priests, and they all pass him. But finally, a Samaritan man walks by, and the Samaritan man stops and helps him, and not only takes him to an inn and to help him recover, but he pays for the man to stay there, and that if he needs anything, he tells the innkeeper, hey, whatever he needs, put it on a tab and I'll pay for it. And so this Good Samaritan, the hero in Jesus' parable in Luke chapter 10, verses 25 through 37, is very significant because the Jews don't view Samaritans as good people, but yet here's Jesus describing one. That's very good. The devout Jews also refused to travel through Samaria, as I mentioned in class today. Even though it was obviously the shortest route between Judea and Galilee, Jews would just go all the way around. In fact, in John chapter 4, Jesus and the disciples, they're going to go from Galilee to Judea, and the disciples want to go around. They want to go around Samaria. In fact, they break off, and Jesus says, you guys go ahead and go. I'm going to make a stop in Samaria. And they were like, what are you doing? You shouldn't be doing that. But he decides to go, and he goes and he meets the woman at the well in John chapter 4, starting around verse 4. And this is, again, very significant that Jesus is hanging out with a Samaritan woman, and he's teaching her about how to worship in spirit and in truth. He said there's going to come a day where you're not going to have to go to Jerusalem to worship. You're going to worship in your spirit. And he reveals himself to her as the Messiah, as the source of living water. And finally, to kind of wrap up our lecture, got a couple more sections to talk about today, but one thing we need to cover, the textbook mentions, is the festival days. Now, there are basically 7 festival days that we need to look at, and the first one is the Pesach, which is Passover. The Pesach, the festival of Pesach, or the festival of Passover and unleavened bread. Now, the festival of Passover, if you weren't aware of this, Passover is a celebration. It commemorates the events of the story of Exodus, when Moses takes the people of Israel who were slaves in Egypt, and he escapes. Remember, you got the 7 plagues, and the 7th plague was when the oldest child of everybody in the land of Egypt would die, when the spirit of death would pass over the house, unless they had the blood of a lamb. And so God told Moses to tell the people of Israel, okay, slaughter a lamb, smear the blood over the doorposts of your house, so that when the spirit of death comes by, it will pass over you and your house. That's where the word Passover comes from. And it's celebrating this Passover event, but it's also celebrating the first fruits or the beginning of the wheat harvest. So not only is it commemorating the Passover event, but it's also commemorating the first fruits of the harvest, when Israel would always go out and harvest their wheat. And number 2 would be the Sabbath festival. This is another festival that you're probably familiar with. At least you probably heard about the Sabbath. There's a Sabbath day, which is technically the 7th day of the week. We a lot of times think that Sunday is the end of our week, that it's day number 7, but it's actually not. Sunday is the beginning of our week. It's day number 1. We call it a weekend, but it's not the end of the week is technically Saturday. God created the world. God created the universe. I'm sorry, in 6 days, and He rested on the seventh day. That seventh day is the Sabbath, and the Sabbath is a day of rest. Not only did God rest on that day, but He told His children. He told the Israelites that on this day you would rest. This Sabbath festival, but it also celebrated the end of the harvest season. Then we have the Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Trumpets. This is the Jewish New Year, end of grape and olive harvest feast. There in the PowerPoint it says New Year's feast, but it's the Rosh Hashanah, or the Festival of Trumpets, if you want to call it that. Then there's the Festival of Yom Kippur. This is the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. Yom, Y-O-M, Kippur, K-I-P-P-U-R. Now, the Yom Kippur was a festival. It was a day of national repentance, fasting, and atonement. Technically, it was not called a festival, but Yom Kippur was a day that is included in their celebrations. And this is important because of the Day of Atonement and when this would fall, and the fact that Jesus came as the final atonement for our sins. Then you have the Sukkot, which is or otherwise known as the Feast of Tabernacles, or Feast of Booths, or Feast of Tents, also called the Feast of Ingathering. So again, the Feast of Tabernacles, also known as the Feast of Booths, or Feast of Tents, or the Feast of Ingathering. This commemorates the Israelites' way of sheltering themselves on their way from Egypt to Canaan. They would stop and build tents. When they would stop for the night, they would put up a tent and sleep in a tent. And this is what they did when they traveled for 40 years in the wilderness from Egypt all the way to Canaan before they eventually settled in the land. Then there's the festival day of Hanukkah, which we've already talked about. Hanukkah is the feast, or the festival of lights, the festival of dedication. Hanukkah is the commemoration of the rededication of the temple by Judas Maccabeus in 164 BC. I already kind of talked about that a minute ago. This festival day, the Hanukkah, celebrates when the Maccabean revolt kicked out the Greeks and reestablished the Jewish temple. This is the holiday for the Jews even today. And then finally, the Purim, the Festival of Lots. And the Purim commemorates the deliverance of Israel in the time of Esther. If you go back and you read the Old Testament book of Esther, Xerxes the First, who was a Persian king, around 486 through about 465, Xerxes is in control, Persia is in control of Israel, and Esther winds up becoming Xerxes' wife. And remember that story I told you about when Alexander the Great defeated the Persians in 333. He's defeating this king, and if you've ever not read the story of Esther, The King and I is based off of this idea, this movie. The Esther, she basically saves the Jews from being exterminated by an evil plot, and she marries Xerxes, and Xerxes listens to her, and so the Festival of Lots commemorates the fact that Esther delivers Israel and the Jews are not killed. And finally, the last thing to mention, again, is the Jewish literature. We've already talked about this a little bit, so I won't spend much time here, but you have to remember that the Jews had a rich treasury of literature that they had held in very high premium value in their everyday lives. Chief among that literature of the Jews was what we know as today the Old Testament, the law, the prophets, and the writings. Remember, this is the Tanakh. Okay, it comes from the abbreviations for Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. So there were other writings that were not included into the Hebrew canon, yet provide great historical value. The primary collection of this type of documents are known as the Apocrypha. Again, we talked about this in class, but the Apocrypha consisted of 14 books written between the Old and the New Testament. Other texts of importance included the Pharisaic teachings gathered over the centuries, known as the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmud. I've already talked about the Talmud a little bit. The Talmud is teachings of the Pharisees throughout the centuries. So it started in Babylonian captivity and continued up until well into the 2nd and 3rd century. Then you have rabbinic literature such as the Mishnah, Misna, which is a collection of rabbinic sayings. There's 63 total tracts recorded by Rabbi Judah the Patriarch at the beginning of the 3rd century. And these tracts, these rabbinic sayings, the Mishnah, dealt with temple ritual, civil and criminal law, marriage, the Sabbath day, things like that. Besides the Mishnah, you also have the Gemara, Gemara. Now, the Gemara are sayings, comments, and rabbinical analyses and commentaries on the Old Testament scriptures, on the Tanakh. So the Gemara are the sayings, comments, and rabbinical analyses and commentaries on the Tanakh. Then you also have the Targums, Targums, Targums. Now, the Targum was the Aramaic translation of the Hebrew Bible, which is obviously very important for the Jews that are living when they leave Babylon and they come back into Jerusalem. Remember, they spoke at that point. The Babylonians forced them to learn Aramaic, and so when they come back to Jerusalem,